A hidden letter, a vanished sapphire, a death no one dares name. Murder can, Miss Marple, unravel a chilling secret buried for decades in St. Mary Mead. Who guards the truth, and what will they do to keep it silent? Chapter 1. The letter from the past in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the roses bloomed with unassuming charm and the church clock ticked with steadfast rhythm. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favourite armchair by the bay window. The late summer light filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a gentle counterpoint to the distant hum of bees in her garden. It was a morning like any other, or so it seemed, until the postman's bicycle crunched to a halt outside her cottage. Miss Marple glanced up, her sharp blue eyes catching the glint of sunlight on the postman's cap as he slipped an envelope. Through the letterbox, she set her knitting aside, her curiosity piqued not by the arrival of mail, which was common enough, but by the weight of this particular letter, which landed with a soft thud, suggesting substance beyond the usual village. Correspondence, rising with the sprightliness that belied her years, she retrieved the envelope from the doormat. It was thick, cream-coloured, and bore the unmistakable crest of Sir Henry Clethering, her old friend and former Commissioner of Scotland Yard. The sight of it stirred a memory of their last meeting. Years ago, when Sir Henry had regaled her with tales of unsolved cases over tea at the vicarage. But Sir Henry had passed away to winters prior, making this letter an enigma. Miss Marple returned to her armchair, adjusted her spectacles, and slit the envelope with a silver letter opener. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper, its edges slightly yellowed, and the ink faded but legible. The date at the top read 5 years earlier, a detail that made her heart quicken. Sir Henry's familiar, precise handwriting greeted her. "My dear Miss Marple, if this letter finds you, it means I am no longer among the living, and a matter of some gravity remains unresolved. You, with your unparalleled insight into human nature, are the only one I trust to unravel it. In 1895, a tragedy befell the Langley family of Langley Hall, near your own St. Mary Mead. A young woman died, and an heirloom sapphire brooch of considerable value. The official report called it an accident, but I have reason to believe it was murder, concealed by those with much to lose. The details are too sensitive to commit fully to paper, but I urge you to visit Langley Hall. The current heir, Evelyn Langley, may hold the key, though she knows not what she possesses. Tread carefully, my friend, for old secrets cast long shadows. Yours in trust." Henry Clethering. Miss Marple folded the letter, her mind already turning over the implications. A murder, hidden for decades, and a missing heirloom. Sir Henry's words carried the weight of unfinished business. She sipped her tea, now lukewarm, and gazed out at the garden, where a black bird hopped along the stone path. The Langley family was vaguely familiar. Their grand estate, Langley Hall, stood just beyond the village, its chimneys visible on clear days. But the name Evelyn Langley was new, suggesting a younger generation unaware of the shadows lurking in their lineage. Determined to act, Miss Marple donned her best tweed coat and straw hat, tucking the letter into her handbag. Langley Hall was a brisk walk away, and the morning was fine for such an errand. As she stepped onto the lane, she passed Mrs. Price, the village busybody, who was polishing her gait with unnecessary vigour. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price called, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. "Off somewhere special?" "Just a stroll to enjoy the air," Miss Marple replied with a serene smile, knowing full well that Mrs. Price would speculate wildly by lunchtime. She continued on, her steps light but purposeful, her mind sifting through memories of the Langley family. They had once been the talk of St. Mary Mead, their wealth and scandals whispered about over tea tables. A death in 1895 would have been before her time as an active observer of village affairs. But she recalled vague tales of a young woman's fall from a balcony, dismissed as a tragic mishap. Langley Hall loomed into view, its ivy-clad walls and tall windows exuding faded grandeur. The iron gates stood ajar, and Miss Marple slipped through, noting the overgrown rose beds and the air of neglect that clung to the grounds. At the front door, she rang the bell, which echoed faintly within. Moments later, a young woman answered, her auburn hair pinned hastily, her green eyes wide with surprise. "Yes," the woman said, her voice polite but wary. "I am Jane Marple, from the village," Miss Marple said, her tone warm yet authoritative. "I believe you are Miss Evelyn Langley. I've come on a matter concerning your family's history." Evelyn's expression flickered with uncertainty, but she stepped aside. "Please, come in. I'm afraid the house is a bit of a mess we're still settling in." The drawing room was a study in contrasts. Elegant furniture draped in dust, sheets, a grand chandelier dulled by time, and a faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. Evelyn offered tea, which Miss Marple accepted, noting the young woman's nervous habit of twisting a silver bracelet on her wrist. Over tea, Miss Marple learned that Evelyn had inherited the estate only recently, following her father's death. She lived alone, save for a housekeeper, and seemed overwhelmed by the responsibilities of the crumbling manor. "I received a letter from an old friend," Miss Marple began, choosing her words carefully. "It mentioned a tragedy in your family long ago, a young woman's death and a missing heirloom. Do you know of such a story?" Evelyn's cup clattered against its saucer. "I've heard whispers," she admitted. "My great-aunt, Eliza, I think. Father said she fell from a balcony, but he never spoke of an heirloom. The family doesn't like to dwell on the past." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes catching the slight tremor in Evelyn's hands. "Sometimes the past demands to be heard," she said gently. "Might I look around? Old houses often hold clues to their stories." Evelyn hesitated, then agreed, leading Miss Marple through echoing corridors to the library, a vast room lined with leather-bound books and heavy oak shelves. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through tall windows. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, settling on a small writing desk tucked in a corner. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward it. "Of course," Evelyn said, though her voice held a note of unease. Miss Marple opened the desk's drawers, finding only faded stationery and a broken fountain pen. But as she pressed the back panel, a soft click revealed a hidden compartment. Inside lay a slim, leather-bound diary, its cover embossed with the initials E.L., presumably Eliza Langley. She slipped it into her handbag, intending to examine it later, away from Evelyn's anxious gaze. "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple said, patting Evelyn's arm. "You've been most kind. I'll return if I learn anything of interest." As she walked back to St. Mary Mead, the diary a reassuring weight in her bag, Miss Marple's mind buzzed with possibilities. Sir Henry's letter had opened a door to a long-buried secret, and the diary promised answers or at least more questions. Back in her cottage, she settled by the fire and opened the diary. Its pages were filled with Eliza's elegant script, detailing her love for a man named Robert and her plan to take the sapphire brooch as her dowry. The final entry, dated the night of her death, read, "He knows I have it. I fear what he might do. Miss Marple closed the diary, her lips pursed. The words confirmed Sir Henry's suspicion. Eliza's death was no accident. Someone had ensured her silence, and the brooch's disappearance was no coincidence. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple resolved to unravel the truth, her quiet determination, as sharp as the needles now resting in her lap. The past had called, and she would answer. Chapter 2. Shadows in the Village. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the village's thatched cottages as Miss Jane Marple stepped out of her cottage, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the cobbled path. Eliza Langley's diary, tucked safely in her handbag, weighed on her mind as much as it did in her hand. Its final entry, "He knows I have it. I fear what he might do," had kept her awake, her thoughts weaving through the possibilities, like threads in her knitting. The sapphire brooch, tied to Eliza's death in 1895, was no mere heirloom. It was a key to a murder, and Miss Marple intended to unlock its secrets. Her destination was the village green, where St. Mary Mead's elderly residents often gathered. On market days, their memories as rich as the soil in their gardens. If anyone recalled the Langley family scandal, it would be them. The green was alive with activity, stalls laden with apples and homemade jams, children darting between carts, and the scent of fresh bread mingling with the crisp autumn air. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, scanned the crowd for a familiar face. She spotted Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, arranging hymnals near the church stall. Mrs. Clement was a kind soul but prone to gossip, a trait Miss Marple found useful in moments like these. "Good morning, Mrs. Clement," she said, approaching with a smile. "A fine day for the market, isn't it?" "Oh, Miss Marple, indeed it is," Mrs. Clement replied, brushing flour from her apron, "though I dare say the village hasn't been this lively since the Langley ball, years ago. You remember those days, don't you?" Miss Marple tilted her head, sensing an opening. Vaguely. The Langleys were quite prominent then, weren't they? I heard talk of a tragedy, a young woman, perhaps. Mrs. Clement's eyes widened, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Eliza Langley, poor dear, fell from the balcony at Langley Hall, they said. An accident, though some whispered it was the curse of that broocher sapphire, big as a robin's egg. My mother swore it brought misfortune to anyone who touched it. A curse. Miss Marple's tone was light, but her mind catalogued the detail. How curious. Did anyone see what happened that night? Mrs. Clement hesitated, glancing around. Well, old Tom Digby might know something. He was a lad then, working at the hall, lives by the mill now, keeps to himself. Thanking her, Miss Marple made her way toward the mill, her steps deliberate. The diary had mentioned a man named Robert, Eliza's suitor, but no witnesses to her fall. Tom Digby, if he had been at Langley Hall, might hold a piece of the puzzle. The mill stood at the village's edge, its wheel creaking lazily over the stream. Tom's cottage was a modest affair, its garden overgrown with nettles, a stark contrast to the tidy plots of St. Mary Mead. She knocked, and after a moment, the door creaked open to reveal Tom Digby, a wiry man in his 70s, his face weathered like old oak. His eyes narrowed at the sight of her. "Miss Marple, what brings you here?" "I'm looking into an old matter," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "The Langley family, specifically Eliza's death. I understand you worked at the hall." Back then, Tom's jaw tightened, and he stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him. "That's a long time ago. Why stir it up now? Sometimes the past demands justice, Miss Marple replied, watching his reaction. I've heard talk of a brooch and a fall that might not have been accidental. Did you see anything that night, Mr. Digby? He stared at the ground, his hands clenching. I was just a stable boy, barely 16. But I remember that night. Storm was brewing, and I was mucking out late. Saw a figure near the hall, by the balcony. Couldn't make out who, but they were moving quick, like they didn't want to be seen. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. A figure, man or woman, couldn't tell, Tom said, his voice low. Too dark, and I was too far. But I heard a scream, sharp and sudden, then nothing. By morning, they said Miss Eliza had fallen. I never spoke up, nobody asked a boy like me. His words hung in the air, heavy with regret. Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted toward the village, as if expecting someone to overhear. You've carried that memory a long time, she said softly. Did you ever hear talk of the sapphire brooch? Tom's gaze snapped back to her, a flicker of fear in his eyes. Aye, the brooch. They said it was stolen, but I reckon it was hidden. The Langleys were greedy for it always, fighting over money. Miss Eliza, she was different, kind, like she didn't belong with them. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The diary had hinted at Eliza's plan to take the brooch, but Tom's story suggested someone else knew of her intentions. Thank you, Mr. Digby, she said. You've been most helpful. As she turned to leave, Tom called after her. Be careful, Miss Marple. The Langleys don't like their secrets, Ed. Some folk might still be watching. The warning sent a shiver down her spine, though she gave no sign of it. She walked back through the village, the market's bustle now a distant hum. At the tea shop, she paused for a scone and a moment to think. The diary, Tom's tale, and Sir Henry's letter were pieces of a mosaic, but the full picture remained elusive. Who was the figure Tom saw? And why had the brooch's disappearance been so neatly tied to Eliza's death? Seated by the tea shop's window, Miss Marple opened the diary again, flipping to a page she'd marked. Eliza had written of a meeting by the old oak near the hall, where she planned to give the brooch to Robert. He says it will secure our future, she wrote, but I fear his urgency. The entry was dated 2 days before her death. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Robert's role was unclear, lover or betrayer, but the oak might hold a clue. She decided to visit the Langley estate again, but not before speaking to one more villager. Old Mrs. Harrow, who lived near the church, had been a maid in her youth and might recall the servants' gossip from that time. Miss Marple found her tending roses, her hands gnarled but steady. Eliza Langley, Mrs. Harrow said, squinting. At Miss Marple's question, a sweet girl caught up in family squabbles. I heard her arguing with her brother, James, about that brooch. He was furious, said it belonged to the family, not her. Night she died, I saw James storming through the village, face like thunder. Miss Marple thanked her, her mind cataloguing James as a new suspect. As she left, she caught Tom Digby watching from across the green, his expression unreadable. The chapter closed as she stood by the church gate, the diary in her hand, her resolve firm. Tom's sighting and Mrs. Harrow's memory had deepened. The mystery pointing to a family rift and a hidden truth. Someone had ensured Eliza's silence, and Miss Marple was determined to find out who. Chapter 3. The Heirlooms Trail. The train to London rattled through the countryside, its rhythm a steady counterpoint to Miss Jane Marple's thoughts as she sat by the window, her knitting untouched in her lap. Eliza Langley's diary, now a familiar weight in her handbag, had pointed her toward a new lead, a cryptic entry mentioning a Mr. C, who had promised to appraise the sapphire brooch for Eliza before her untimely death. Miss Marple's sharp mind, honed by years of observing human nature, suspected this Mr. C might be a Langley relative, and the most likely candidate was Charles Langley, Evelyn's cousin, known to dabble in antiques in the city, the village. Whispers of Chapter 2, Tom Digby's sighting of a shadowy figure, and Mrs. Harrow's tale of James. Langley's anger had deepened the mystery, but London held the promise of answers. The bustle of Paddington Station greeted her as she stepped off the train, her tweed coat a touch provincial amid the city's swirl of hats and briefcases. Charles Langley's shop, Langley and Sons Antiques, was tucked in a narrow street off Bond Street, its window displaying a gleaming array of silver candelabras and porcelain vases. Miss Marple paused outside, noting the polished brass sign and the faint air of exclusivity. She adjusted her hat, her serene smile masking the keen observation in her eyes, and pushed open the door, a bell jingling softly. Charles Langley stood behind a mahogany counter, a man in his early 40s with hair and a tailored suit that spoke of ambition. His charm was immediate, his smile wide as he greeted her. "Good afternoon. Welcome to Langley and Sons. Are you looking for something particular?" Miss Marple returned a smile, her voice gentle but deliberate. "I'm Jane Marple from St. Mary Mead. I've come about your family's history. Mr. Langley, specifically, an heirloom, a sapphire brooch, lost long ago." Charles's smile faltered, though he recovered quickly, polishing a glass paperweight with undue focus. "The brooch, an old family legend, I'm afraid. Stolen, they say, after my great-aunt Eliza's accident. Why the interest, Miss Marple?" She watched his hands, noting the slight tremor as he set the paperweight down. "I've been looking into Eliza's death," she said, her tone conversational. "Some believe it was no accident, and the brooch's disappearance seems tied to it. You deal in antiques, have you ever come across it? Perhaps with a family friend?" Charles laughed, a touch too loudly. "Goodness, no. That brooch is long gone, probably pawned or melted down decades ago. I deal in verifiable pieces, Miss Marple, not fairy tales." But his eyes darted to a ring on his left hand, a heavy silver band with a blue stone that caught the light. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it, her mind noting its similarity to descriptions of the Langley sapphire. "Quite a striking ring," she remarked, her voice mild. "A family piece, perhaps." He tucked his hand behind the counter, his smile tightening. "A trinket, nothing more. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a client due soon." Miss Marple nodded, sensing his unease. "Of course. Thank you for your time, Mr. Langley." She left the shop, the bell jingling behind her, and stepped into the London air, now tinged with the scent of rain. Charles's evasiveness confirmed her suspicion. He knew more than he let on, and the ring was no mere trinket. But she needed more than intuition to unravel the thread. Her next stop was a small tea room nearby, where she could think undisturbed. Over a pot of Earl Grey, she opened Eliza's diary. Flipping to a passage she'd marked, "Mr. C promised to meet me in London to value the brooch. He says it could fetch a fortune, but I trust him not. Robert urges me to act quickly." The mention of London and Mr. C aligned with Charles, but the diary suggested he or his ancestor had a motive beyond appraisal. Had Eliza been betrayed by this Mr. C? As she sipped her tea, A shadow fell across her table. A young woman, dressed in a modest grey coat, hesitated before speaking. "Miss Marple, I overheard you in the shop. I'm Clara, Charles's assistant. I shouldn't be here, but you mentioned the brooch." Miss Marple's eyes softened, inviting trust. "Please, sit down, my dear. What do you know?" Clara glanced nervously at the door before leaning in. "Charles keeps a locked drawer in his office. I've seen him take out papers, old ones, with the Langley crest. Once, he mentioned a family debt, something about keeping it buried. I don't know if it's the brooch, but he's been jumpy since you arrived." Miss Marple's mind raced, though her expression remained calm. "A debt, you say? And these papers, do they mention Eliza Langley?" "I didn't read them," Clara admitted, twisting her scarf. "But I heard him on the phone last week, talking about St. Mary Mead. He sounded angry. Said something about no one digging up the past." "Thank you, Clara," Miss Marple said, patting her hand. "You've been very brave." As Clara hurried away, Miss Marple made a mental note. Charles's connection to the brooch was clearer now, and his mention of St. Mary Mead suggested he was aware of her inquiries. The locked drawer was tempting, but she lacked the means to access it yet. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden downpour, forcing her to take shelter in a nearby bookshop. Browsing the shelves, she stumbled upon a dusty volume on Victorian jewellery, its pages detailing the Langley sapphire brooch as a piece commissioned for a royal wedding. Its value immense even in 1895. A footnote mentioned its last known owner, a family friend, deceased shortly after Eliza. Miss Marple's lips pursed. The friend's death was new information, suggesting another layer to the cover dash up. As evening fell, she checked into a modest hotel near the station, her mind buzzing with the day's discoveries. Before retiring, she penned a note to Evelyn Langley, requesting a second visit to the hall to discuss family matters. But as she sealed the envelope, a folded paper slipped under her door. She opened it to find a single line in stark black ink. "Leave the past alone, or you'll regret it." Miss Marple folded the note, her heart steady despite the threat. It was proof she was on the right path. Someone, likely Charles or an ally, was rattled. She placed the note in her handbag beside the diary, her resolve unshaken. The chapter closed as she gazed out at the rain-slicked London street, the city's lights blurring into a mosaic of secrets. Charles's ring, Clara's revelation, and the mysterious family friend had woven a tighter net around the truth. The sapphire brooch was out there, and Miss Marple was determined to follow its trail. Chapter 4. A scandal unearthed. The morning sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple walked purposefully toward the village church, her handbag heavier with the weight of Eliza Langley's diary and the ominous note from London. The note's stark warning, "Leave the past alone, or you'll regret it," had only sharpened her resolve. Charles Langley's nervous demeanour and the locked drawer in his antique shop suggested he was entangled in the mystery of the sapphire brooch. But Miss Marple needed evidence to connect his actions to Eliza's death in 1895. The church, with its dusty archives and long memory, was the next logical step. The churchyard was quiet, save for the soft rustle of leaves and the distant bleating of sheep. Miss Marple pushed open the heavy oak door, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through stained glass windows. The vicar, Mr. Clement, was arranging hymnals at the altar, his spectacles slipping down his nose. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his voice warm but tinged with curiosity. "Not your usual day for a visit. Is something amiss?" "Not amiss," Mr. Clement, merely curious," she replied, her tone light. "I'm looking into an old matter, the Langley family. Specifically, a tragedy from 1895. Might I trouble you for access to the parish records?" Mr. Clement's eyebrows rose, but he nodded, leading her to a small vestry where shelves sagged under the weight of leather-bound ledgers. "The Langleys were prominent here once," he said, pulling a volume marked 1890 to 1900. Eliza Langley's death caused quite a stir, though it was hushed up quickly. An accident, they claimed. Miss Marple opened the ledger, her fingers tracing the faded ink. The entry for Eliza Langley was brief. Eliza Margaret Langley, age 22. Deceased the 14th of September, 1895. Accidental fall. But a marginal note, scrawled in a different hand, caught her eye. Coroner's inquest inconclusive. Bruising inconsistent with fall. Her heart quickened. The note suggested foul play, buried under the weight of the Langley family's influence. "Did anyone question the verdict at the time?" she asked, her voice steady despite the discovery. Mr. Clement frowned, adjusting his spectacles. "Not openly. The Langleys were powerful, and the coroner, a friend of theirs, closed the matter swiftly. But I recall my father saying the servants whispered of a quarrel that night. Something about a family heirloom." Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. The diary had mentioned Eliza's plan to take the sapphire brooch, and Tom Digby's account of a figure near the balcony hinted at a witness or a culprit. The coroner's note was a new thread, suggesting someone had suspected murder but lacked the power to pursue it. She thanked Mr. Clement and stepped into the churchyard, her mind turning over the possibilities. Her next stop was the Langley estate, where she hoped to speak with Evelyn's aunt, Margaret Langley, who had lived at the Hall during Eliza's time. The walk was brisk, the air sharp with the scent of autumn leaves. At the estate, Evelyn greeted her at the door, her auburn hair neatly pinned today, though her eyes held a flicker of unease. "Miss Marple, I got your note," she said. "Is this about the brooch?" "In part," Miss Marple replied, stepping into the familiar drawing-room, now free of dust sheets, but still heavy with the weight of history. "I'd like to speak with your aunt, if she's available. I understand she was close to the family in 1895. Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. "Aunt Margaret's in the conservatory. She's particular, but I'll fetch her." Moments later, Margaret Langley entered, a tall woman in her late 60s, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun. Her grey eyes assessed Miss Marple with a coolness that bordered on disdain. "Miss Marple, is that Evelyn says? You're prying into family matters. What's this nonsense about a brooch?" Miss Marple smiled, unruffled. "Not nonsense, Mrs. Langley. I'm looking into Eliza's death, and the disappearance of a sapphire brooch. I believe they're connected. You were at the Hall then. Do you recall anything unusual?" Margaret's lips thinned, her fingers tightening on a silk shawl. Eliza was foolish, always dreaming beyond her station. Her fall was a tragedy. Nothing more. As for the brooch, it was stolen by some servant, no doubt. "You're wasting your time." But Miss Marple noticed the slight flush in Margaret's cheeks, the way her eyes darted to a portrait above the fireplace's stern man in Victorian attire, likely Eliza's father. "It's curious," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational, "that the coroner noted bruising inconsistent with a fall, and there were rumours of a quarrel, perhaps over the brooch. Did you hear such talk?" Margaret's composure faltered, her shawl slipping slightly. "Servants' gossip," she snapped. Eliza was reckless, climbing balconies at night. The family suffered enough without these old tales being dredged up. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze lingering on Margaret's hands, now clasped tightly. The woman's defensiveness was telling, a crack in the Langley facade. "Thank you, Mrs. Langley," she said. "I shan't trouble you further today." As Evelyn escorted her out, Miss Marple paused by the portrait, noting a resemblance to Charles Langley's sharp features. "Your aunt seems protective of the family name," she remarked. Evelyn sighed. "She's always been like that, father," said she, and Uncle James, her husband, were fierce about the estate's legacy. "But she's been kinder to me since I inherited." Miss Marple filed the mention of James away, recalling Mrs. Harrow's story of his anger toward Eliza. Back in the village, she returned to the church, determined to search the archives further. Mr. Clement, busy with a parish meeting, had left. The vestry unlocked. She sifted through a box of photographs, hoping for a visual clue. Near the bottom, she found a faded image of a young woman in a high-necked gown, a sapphire brooch pinned to her chest. The back was inscribed, "Eliza Langley, 1895. Her breath caught. The brooch matched descriptions, starburst of sapphires, with a central stone gleaming like twilight. This was no mere heirloom. It was a motive, perhaps worth killing for. As she tucked the photograph into her handbag, a shadow moved outside the vestry window. She froze, her heart steady but alert. The shadow passed, but the moment reminded her of Tom Digby's warning. Some folk might still be watching. Miss Marple left the church, the photograph a tangible link to Eliza's fate. The coroner's note and Margaret's unease suggested a cover-up, possibly orchestrated by James or someone close to him. The chapter closed as she stood on the village green, the church bells chiming noon, her mind weaving the threads together. The brooch, now confirmed by the photograph, was the heart of the mystery, and Margaret's reaction hinted at secrets still guarded. Miss Marple's next step would be to probe deeper into the Langley family's past, undeterred by the shadows that followed. This chapter advances the story with new settings: the church vestry, the Langley conservatory, unique interactions with Mr. Clement and Margaret, and fresh clues: the coroner's note, the photograph. It avoids repeating elements from previous chapters, such as London or Charles's shop, and ends with a satisfying resolution: the discovery of the photograph while setting up Miss Marple's next investigation. The narrative keeps the tone, engaging and suspenseful, with distinct details to maintain variety. If you have specific preferences or want to adjust the direction, let me know. Chapter 5. The Auction House in The London air was thick with the scent of wet pavement as Miss Jane Marple stepped out of her hotel, her umbrella raised against a persistent drizzle. The photograph of Eliza Langley, pinned with the sapphire brooch, rested in her handbag beside the threatening note in Eliza's diary. The coroner's note from Chapter 4, hinting at foul play, and Margaret Langley's defensive demeanour had deepened the mystery. But Miss Marple's thoughts turned back to Charles Langley. His evasive answers and the blue-stoned ring in his antique shop suggested he might know the brooch's fate. A discreet inquiry at her hotel had revealed Charles was hosting an auction at a prestigious Mayfair house today, and Miss Marple suspected the brooch a clue to it might surface there. The auction house, a grand Georgian building with marble steps and crystal chandeliers, buzzed with well-dressed patrons clutching catalogues. Miss Marple, in her unassuming tweed coat, blended into the crowd, her sharp eyes scanning the room. Charles stood at the podium, his charm on full display as he described a gilded clock to eager bidders. She took a seat near the back, her knitting needles clicking softly. A guise that allowed her to observe without drawing attention. The lots progressed: vases, paintings, a silver tea set, but no sapphire brooch appeared. Miss Marple's attention shifted to the bidders, particularly a woman in a navy hat who bid fiercely on a pair of sapphire earrings. Her manner was tense, her gloved hands gripping the catalogue tightly. When the earrings sold to another, the woman muttered something sharp and rose, brushing past Charles as she left. Miss Marple caught a fleeting glance between them, a silent exchange that spoke of familiarity. Determined to identify her, Miss Marple followed the woman to the foyer, where she overheard a porter address her as Miss Weston. The name stirred. A memory Clara, Charles's assistant from Chapter 3, had mentioned no surname, but this could be another connection. Miss Marple approached, her voice gentle. "Miss Weston, I'm Jane Marple. I noticed your interest in the sapphire earrings. Are you a collector of such gems?" The woman turned, her hazel eyes wary but softened by Miss Marple's kindly demeanor. "Clara Weston," she confirmed, her voice low. "I collect for sentiment, not value. Those earrings reminded me of something from long ago." Miss Marple tilted her head, sensing an opening. "Something like a sapphire brooch, perhaps. I'm looking into an old Langley family matter. You know Charles, I believe." Clara's face paled, and she glanced toward the auction room where Charles was now describing a porcelain figurine. "I worked for the Langleys years ago at the hall," she said. "Charles and we've stayed in touch. But the brooch, that's a dangerous topic, Miss Marple." They moved to a quiet corner, where Clara's words came in a rush. "I was a maid in 1895, just a girl. The night Eliza died, I saw her on the balcony, arguing with someone, a man, I think, but it was dark. The next morning, they said she fell. I was sent away soon after, with a sum to keep quiet. I've always regretted it." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "And the brooch, did you see it that night?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Eliza wore it. She said it was her ticket to a new life. After her death, it vanished. Thought Charles might know something. He was always poking through family relics, but he denies it." Miss Marple noted the tremor in Clara's voice, the weight of old guilt. "You've carried this a long time," she said softly. "Would you help me find the truth?" Clara's eyes darted to the auction room, where Charles's voice echoed. "I can't stay here," she whispered. "But meet me at the Rose Calf, across the street, in an hour. I'll tell you more." Miss Marple agreed, and Clara slipped away. The auction continued, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. Clara's story aligned with Tom Digby's sighting of a figure near the balcony, and the mention of a payoff suggested a concerted effort to bury the truth. She stayed until the auction ended, watching Charles closely. His charm never wavered, but she noticed him slip a small velvet pouch into his pocket as he left the podium at the Rose Calf. Miss Marple found Clara at a corner table, her navy hat now replaced with a scarf. Over tea, Clara's story unfolded further. "After I was dismissed, I heard rumors the brooch was hidden, not stolen. Charles's father, James, was furious about Eliza's plans. She was going to run off with a man, taking the brooch. James said it belonged to the family, not her." Miss Marple's thoughts flashed to Mrs. Harrow's mention of James's anger. "And you think Charles knows where it is?" she asked. Clara nodded. "He's been selling off family pieces quietly. Last week, he got a call from someone in St. Mary. Mead sounded like they were warning him about you. That's all I know, but..." She reached into her bag and slid a small brass key across the table. "This opens a safe deposit box at the bank on Regent Street. I found it in Charles's shop, hidden in a book. It might hold answers." Miss Marple took the key, her fingers brushing the cool metal. "You've been very brave, Clara," she said. "I'll see this through." As Clara left, Miss Marple lingered, the cafe-esque warmth a contrast to the chill of the mystery. The key was a tangible lead, possibly to the papers Clara had mentioned in Charles's locked drawer. The payoff and James's involvement painted a picture of greed and betrayal, with Charles as a modern link to the past. But the warning call from St. Mary Mead troubled her. Someone was watching her movements. Perhaps Margaret or even Tom Digby. Back at her hotel, Miss Marple examined the key, its surface etched with a faint Eltha Langley crest, she suspected. She resolved to visit the bank tomorrow, but first she penned a note to Evelyn, asking her to keep an eye on Margaret's activities at the hall. As she sealed the envelope, she glanced at the window, half expecting another shadow or note. None came, but the weight of Clara's confession and the key in her hand told her the net was tightening. The chapter closed as Miss Marple sat by her hotel window, the London skyline a blur of lights against the dusk. The auction had revealed Clara's secret, and the key promised to unlock more of the Langley family's hidden truths. Eliza's death was no accident, and the sapphire brooch was at its heart. Miss Marple's resolve was firm. She would follow the trail, undeterred by warnings or shadows. This chapter advances the story with new settings: the auction house, the rose calf, unique interactions with Clara Weston, and fresh clues: Clara's confession, the safe deposit key. It avoids repeating elements from previous chapters, such as the church archives or Margaret's confrontation, and ends with a satisfying resolution: the acquisition of the key while setting up Miss Marple's next move to the bank. The narrative maintains an engaging and suspenseful tone with distinct details to ensure variety. If you have specific preferences or want to adjust the direction, let me know. Chapter 6. Secrets in the Safe. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Miss Jane Marple's London hotel room, casting a soft glow on the brass key that lay on her bedside table. The key, entrusted to her by Clara Weston at the rose calf, bore the faint etching of the Langley crest, a clue to the sapphire brooch's fate and Eliza Langley's murder in 1895, the events of the auction house, Clara's revelation of witnessing an argument on the balcony, and the payoff. To silence her had tightened the web around Charles Langley, but Miss Marple needed concrete evidence. The safe deposit box at the Regent Street Bank promised answers, and she intended to uncover them. Dressed in her familiar tweed coat, Miss Marple navigated the bustling streets of London, her umbrella tapping lightly against the pavement. The bank, a formidable stone building with polished brass fittings, exuded an air of unyielding authority. Inside, the clerk, a young man with a starched collar, eyed her curiously as she presented the key. "Safe deposit box, 214, ma'am," he confirmed, checking his ledger. "May I have your name?" "Jane Marple," she replied, her voice serene but firm. "I'm acting on behalf of a Langley family inquiry." The clerk hesitated, then led her to a vault lined with numbered boxes. He inserted the key, turned it with a soft click, and slid out a metal drawer. "I'll leave you to it," he said, retreating to his desk. Miss Marple opened the drawer, her heart steady despite the anticipation. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a small velvet pouch, and a yellowed newspaper clipping. She slipped them into her handbag, aware that lingering in the vault might draw attention. Back at her hotel, in the privacy of her room, Miss Marple examined her findings. The letters, written in Eliza's elegant hand, were addressed to a Robert Vane. They detailed a passionate but secretive romance, with Eliza planning to elope with Robert and use the sapphire brooch to fund their new life. One letter, dated a week before her death, read, "Robert, the brooch is ours, but James knows. He threatens to ruin us if I take it. I fear his anger, but my heart is yours." Miss Marple's lips pursed. James, Charles's father and Margaret's late husband, had been a key figure in the tragedy, as Mrs. Harrow's village gossip had suggested. The newspaper clipping from our 1895 edition of the St. Mary Mead Gazette reported Eliza's death as an unfortunate accident, but noted a brief inquest quickly dismissed by the Langley family's influence. The velvet pouch, however, was empty, its lining frayed as if something, perhaps the brooch, had been removed. Miss Marple's mind turned to Charles. Clara had mentioned his interest in family relics, and the empty pouch suggested he might have accessed the box recently. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. A porter handed her a telegram from Evelyn Langley, sent in response to Miss Marple's note from Chapter 5. Aunt Margaret, acting strangely, found her burning papers in the garden last night. Please come soon. The message confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion that Margaret was guarding secrets, possibly linked to James's role in Eliza's death. She decided to return to St. Mary Mead that afternoon, but not before making one more inquiry at a nearby public library. Miss Marple consulted a directory of London families, searching for Robert Vane. The records listed him as a solicitor's clerk, deceased in 1896, a year after Eliza. The cause was vague, sudden illness, but the timing struck her as suspicious. Had Robert been silenced, too? She jotted down the details, her mind weaving connections between Robert, James, and the missing brooch. The train back to St. Mary Mead was quieter than her outbound journey, giving her time to reflect. The letters confirmed Eliza's plan to elope, but James's threat suggested a motive for murder. Margaret's paper burning and Charles's evasiveness pointed to a family conspiracy, still active decades later. As the countryside rolled by, Miss Marple noticed a young man in the carriage opposite, his hat pulled low, watching her over his newspaper. When their eyes met, he quickly looked away, but she memorized his feature-sharp cheekbones, a thin scar above his brow at St. Mary Mead Station. She walked briskly to the Langley estate, the letters and clipping safe in her handbag. Evelyn met her at the gate, her face pale. "Miss Marple, I'm so glad you're here," she whispered. "Aunt Margaret's been in the attic all day, locking the door. And I've been getting odd calls, someone asking if I've spoken to you, then hanging up." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, recalling the man on the train. "Curious," she said. "Let's see what we can learn from the house itself." Evelyn led her to the drawing room, where the portrait of Eliza's father still hung, its stern gaze unchanged. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the empty pouch. Had the brooch been moved recently? She asked Evelyn to show her the attic, but as they climbed the creaking stairs, a faint smell of smoke lingered. The attic door was ajar, revealing a clutter of trunks and cobwebs. A small brazier sat in the corner, its ashes fresh. She was burning something here, too, Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "I didn't dare look." Miss Marple sifted through the ashes, finding fragments of paper with the Langley crest. similar to those Clara had described in Charles's shop. One scrap bore the word brooch, confirming Margaret's attempt to erase evidence. "Your aunt is protecting someone," Miss Marple said gently, "or something." As they descended, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of movement in the gardener, figures slipping behind the yew hedge. Her heart quickened, but she kept her composure. "Evelyn, my dear, have you noticed anyone unfamiliar around the estate?" Evelyn frowned. "Not really, but the gardener mentioned seeing a man near the oak tree yesterday. I thought it was just a vagrant." The oak tree mentioned in Eliza's diary as her meeting place with Robert. Miss Marple resolved to investigate it later. But for now, she focused on Evelyn. "Keep your eyes open," she advised, "and don't mention our talk to your aunt." As she left the estate, the village was settling into dusk, the church spire a dark silhouette against the sky. Miss Marple paused by the post office, where she overheard two women discussing a stranger seen near the mill, possibly the same man from the train. The chapter closed as she stood under a lamppost, the safe deposit box's contents a new thread in the mystery. The letters had exposed James's threat, and Margaret's actions suggested she was complicit. Someone was watching, perhaps the same person behind the threatening note, but Miss Marple's resolve was unshaken. She would return to the oak tree, certain it held the next clue. This chapter advances the story with new settings: the bank vault, the hotel, the Langley attic, unique interactions with the bank clerk and Evelyn, and fresh clues: the letters, the empty pouch, the burned papers. It avoids repeating elements from previous chapters, such as the auction house or Clara's confession, and ends with a satisfying resolution: the discovery of the letters, while setting up Miss Marple's investigation of the oak tree. The narrative maintains an engaging and suspenseful tone with distinct details to ensure variety. If you have specific preferences or want to adjust the direction, let me know. Chapter 7. The Garden Confrontation. The late afternoon sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the Langley estate's sprawling gardens as Miss Jane Marple stepped through the iron gates. The letters from the safe deposit box, revealing Eliza Langley's plan to elope with Robert Vane and James Langley's threatening opposition, weighed heavily in her mind. Margaret's burning of papers and Evelyn's report of a stranger near the oak tree mentioned in Eliza's diary as a meeting place suggested the past was far from buried. Miss Marple, her handbag clutched tightly, was determined to confront the living Langleys and unravel the truth behind the sapphire brooch and Eliza's murder in 1895. Evelyn had agreed to host a small tea in the estate's drawing room, inviting her Aunt Margaret and cousin Charles, who was visiting from London. Miss Marple had suggested the gathering, framing it as a chance to discuss family history, but her true aim was to observe their reactions to carefully placed questions. The drawing room, now dusted and brightened by fresh flowers, felt less oppressive than before, though the portrait of Eliza's father still loomed over the fireplace, its stern gaze a silent witness. Evelyn greeted her warmly, her auburn hair catching the light. "Miss Marple, I'm so glad you're here," she said, her voice tinged with nervousness. "Aunt Margaret's already arrived, and Charles is on his way. I hope this helps. Whatever you're looking for," Miss Marple patted her arm. "You're doing splendidly, my dear. Just keep the tea flowing, and we'll see what surfaces." Margaret entered, her silver hair as severe as ever, her grey eyes narrowing at Miss Marple. "I trust this won't be another interrogation," she said, settling into a high-backed chair. "The Langley name has endured enough gossip." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, her tone serene. "I'm merely curious about Eliza's time. Such a tragedy, her fall. And that sapphire brooch quite a treasure, wasn't it?" Margaret's teacup clinked sharply against its saucer, her lips thinning. "A gaudy thing, long gone, stolen, most likely. Why dwell on it?" Before Miss Marple could press further, Charles swept in, his London suit impeccable, but his smile strained. "Miss Marple, a pleasure," he said, though his eyes flicked to Margaret, a silent question passing between them. Miss Marple noted the exchange, her knitting needles clicking softly as she took a seat, over tea and scones. She steered the conversation lightly, mentioning village tales of the brooch's curse and Eliza's accident. Charles laughed, a touch too heartily. "Village superstitions," he said, sipping his tea. "Eliza was careless, climbing balconies in a storm. The brooch was just a bauble, hardly worth killing for." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Yet it was valuable enough to vanish that night. And I hear there was an argument, perhaps with James, your father, Mrs. Langley." Margaret's face flushed, her shawl slipping. "Nonsense," she snapped. "James was devoted to the family. Eliza was reckless, that's all." The tension was palpable, broken only by a sudden commotion at the door. Tom Digby, the gardener from Chapter 2, burst in, his weathered face flushed with anger. "Enough lies," he shouted, pointing at Margaret. "You know what happened to my sister, Eliza. You and James covered it up." Evelyn gasped, her teacup trembling. Charles rose, his charm replaced by a scowl. "Tom, you're out of line. Leave now." But Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice calm but commanding. "Let him speak, Mr. Langley. Mr. Digby, what do you mean?" Tom's eyes blazed, fixed on Margaret. "Eliza was my sister, though the Langleys never admitted it. She was born out of wedlock, hidden away. That night, I saw James on the balcony with her, arguing about the brooch. Next thing, she was dead, and they paid me to keep quiet. I was just a boy, scared and poor, but I've carried it all these years." Margaret's face drained of colour, her hands clutching a locket at her throat, a detail Miss Marple hadn't noticed before. "You're delusional," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "Eliza was no kin of yours. This is slander." Miss Marple's mind raced. Tom's claim that Eliza was his sister was new, explaining his protective demeanour and his warning to be careful. The locket, glinting in the light, suggested another clue, perhaps a keepsake tied to the past. "Mr. Digby," she said gently, "did you ever see the brooch after that night?" Tom shook his head, his anger softening to grief. "It was gone, like Eliza. James said it was stolen, but I reckon he hid it to keep the family's wealth intact." Charles stepped forward, his voice sharp. "This is absurd. Tom, you'll regret these accusations. Miss Marple, you're stirring up trouble where there's none." Miss Marple met his gaze, unruffled. "The truth often stirs trouble, Mr. Langley, but it has a way of surfacing." Margaret stood abruptly, her locket catching the light as she stormed out, muttering about village fools. Charles followed, casting a wary glance at Miss Marple. Evelyn, pale and shaken, turned to her. "Is it true? Was Eliza Tom's sister?" "It's possible," Miss Marple said softly. "And if so, it changes the motive. The brooch wasn't just wealth, it was Eliza's claim to a new life, one James opposed." As Tom left, his shoulders slumped. Miss Marple lingered in the drawing room, her eyes on Margaret's abandoned shawl. She picked it up, noticing a faint monogrammy L stitched in the corner. It could belong to Evelyn, but the fabric was old, possibly Eliza's. She tucked it into her handbag, resolving to examine it later. Outside, she walked to the garden, drawn to the oak tree Evelyn had mentioned. Its gnarled branches loomed over a stone bench, the spot where Eliza planned to meet Robert Vane. Miss Marple knelt, her fingers brushing the earth beneath the bench. Nothing was buried there, but a faint scratch on the stone caught her eye. Heart with E and R carved inside. Eliza and Robert, a testament to their love, and perhaps a clue to their betrayal. As dusk settled, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the shawl and Tom's revelation adding new layers to the mystery. The chapter closed as she sat by her fire, the locket's image fixed in her mind. Margaret's reaction and Tom's accusation pointed to James as the likely culprit, with Margaret complicit in the cover-up. The sapphire brooch remained elusive, but the locket might hold the key to its hiding place. Miss Marple's resolve was firm. She would probe deeper, undeterred by the family's resistance. Chapter 8. The midnight confession. The moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a silver glow on the thatched roofs as Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage window, her knitting untouched. The events of the tea at Langley Holtham Digby's explosive claim that Eliza Langley was his sister, Margaret's abrupt departure clutching her locket, and the monogrammed shawl with E.L. had tightened the threads of the mystery surrounding the sapphire brooch and Eliza's murder in 1895. The carved heart at the oak tree, etched with E and R, confirmed Eliza's love for Robert Vane. But Miss Marple suspected the brooch's hiding place was closer than she'd thought. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at her door, an unusual sound at this late hour. She rose, her heart steady despite the hour, and opened the door to find Clara Weston, the former Langley maid from Chapter 5, standing in the shadows. Clara's navy scarf was pulled tight, her hazel eyes wide with fear. "Miss Marple, I'm sorry to come so late," she whispered. "I had to wait until I was sure no one followed me." "Come in, my dear," Miss Marple said, ushering her to the fireside. "You're trembling. What's happened?" Clara sat, her hands twisting the scarf. "After we met at the cafe, I went back to Charles's shop. He was furious, saying someone in St. Mary Mead had warned him you were asking questions. I think he knows about the key I gave you." Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling the threatening note from London. "Go on," she said gently, pouring Clara a cup of tea from a pot kept warm on the hearth. Clara took a shaky sip. "I couldn't stay silent anymore. That night in 1895, I saw more than I told you. I was in the hall's kitchen, cleaning, when I heard Eliza arguing on the balcony. It was James Charles's father. He was shouting about the brooch, saying it belonged to the family, not her lowly lover. I crept closer and saw him grab her arm. Then there was a scream, and she fell." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained calm. "You saw James push her." Clara shook her head, tears welling. "I didn't see the push, but he was there, and she wasn't climbing, like they said. After, he found me hiding, gave me money, and told me to leave St. Mary Mead. I was young, scared I took it and ran, but I've carried the guilt ever since." The confession hung heavy in the room, the fire's crackle the only sound. Miss Marple's mind rested Clara's account, aligned with Tom's sighting of a figure and his claim that James had silenced him too. "And the brooch?" she asked. "Did you see it after?" Clara nodded. Eliza was wearing it that night, pinned to her dress. After she fell, it was gone. I heard James tell Margaret to make sure it stayed hidden. I think they buried it somewhere on the estate. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the garden, to the oak tree where Eliza met Robert. "You've been very brave, Clara," she said. "This helps more than you know. But why come now?" "Charles," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "He's been acting strange, checking the garden at night. I think he's looking for the brooch, or making sure it's still hidden. I couldn't stay silent, not with you so close to the truth." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Stay here tonight, my dear. It's safer. I'll see to the rest." After settling Clara in the guest room, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her mind weaving the new threads. James's role in Eliza's death was clearer, and Margaret's involvement in hiding the brooch suggested a deeper complicity. The garden was the next step, but she needed help to search without arousing suspicion. She penned a note to Evelyn, asking her to join her at dawn to explore the oak tree, framing it as a gardening interest. At first light, Miss Marple met Evelyn at the Langley Estate's garden gate, the air crisp with dew. Evelyn, bundled in a coat, looked anxious but determined. "I haven't told Aunt Margaret," she whispered. "She's been locking herself in her room since the tea." "Good," Miss Marple said, her eyes scanning the garden. "Let's start at the oak tree." It meant something to Eliza, and perhaps to James. The oak stood majestic, its roots gnarled and exposed. Miss Marple knelt, her fingers brushing the earth where the carved heart marked the stone bench. If the brooch was hidden, it would be somewhere significant, she said, a place Eliza loved. Evelyn, catching her enthusiasm, began digging near the roots with a small trowel. After a few minutes, her trowel struck something hard. She unearthed a small tin box, rusted but intact, its lid engraved with the Langley crest. Miss Marple's heart quickened as Evelyn pried it open, revealing a velvet pouch. Inside glittered the sapphire brooch, its starburst of gems catching the dawn light like a captured sky. "It's beautiful," Evelyn breathed, but her voice held a tremor. "Is this what killed Eliza?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, tucking the brooch into her handbag. "But its discovery will force the truth into the open." As they stood, a rustle in the bushes made them turn. A figure darted away too quick to identify, but Miss Marple noted the flash of a dark coat. "Someone's watching," she said. Calmly, "We must be cautious." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple examined the brooch, its weight confirming its value. The tin box bore scratches, suggesting it had been buried hastily. Clara, still at the cottage, gasped when she saw it. "That's it," she said. "Eliza's brooch." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the next step. The brooch's recovery was a triumph, but it would provoke a reaction from James's accomplices, Margaret, Charles, or perhaps the stranger in the garden. She resolved to confront them, but carefully, to avoid tipping her hand. The chapter closed as Miss Marple sat by her window, the brooch hidden in a drawer, her knitting resumed as a guise for her racing thoughts. Clara's confession had confirmed James's guilt, and the brooch's discovery was a tangible link to the past. But the watcher in the garden and Margaret's locked room suggested the danger was far from over. Miss Marple's resolve was firm. She would set a trap to expose the killer, ready to face whatever shadows emerged. Chapter 9. The trap is set. The evening shadows stretched long across St. Mary Mead, as Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage. The sapphire brooch safely hidden in a locked drawer beside her knitting basket. Clara Weston's midnight confession had confirmed James Langley's role in Eliza's murder, and the brooch's discovery under the oak tree unearthed with Evelyn's help had brought the truth tantalizingly close. Yet the watcher in the garden glimpsed as a fleeting dark coat, and Margaret's secretive behavior suggested the Langley family was still guarding their past. Miss Marple knew the brooch's recovery would provoke a reaction, and she resolved to set a trap to expose the guilty. Her plan was simple but bold. Gather the key players Evelyn, Margaret, Charles, and Tom Digby at Langley Hall and announce the brooch's recovery, weaving a deliberate fiction to flush out the culprit. She penned invitations for a historical discussion the next evening, framing it as a chance to honor Eliza's memory. To Evelyn, she added a private note: say nothing of the brooch. Watch your aunt and cousin closely. Miss Marple, sharp mind, honed by years of village observations, anticipated that the guilty party would betray themselves under pressure. The following evening, Langley Hall glowed with lamplight, its drawing room arranged with chairs in a semicircle, a fire crackling in the hearth. Evelyn greeted Miss Marple at the door, her green eyes anxious but resolute. "I've done as you asked," she whispered. "Aunt Margaret's been pacing all day, and Charles arrived an hour ago, looking grim." Miss Marple nodded, her serene smile masking her alertness. "Good, my dear. Let's see what the evening reveals." Margaret entered first, her silver hair pulled tight, her locket noticed during the tea in Chapter 7 glinting at her throat. "This is a waste of time," she said, her voice sharp as she took a seat. "Eliza's death was a tragedy, not a mystery." Charles followed, his tailored suit impeccable but his eyes darting nervously. "Miss Marple, I hope this isn't another round of accusations," he said, forcing a smile. "The family's had enough of that." Tom Digby arrived last, his weathered face set in determination. He avoided Margaret's gaze, sitting near Evelyn, who offered him a reassuring nod. Miss Marple stood before the group, her hands folded, her voice calm but carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Thank you for coming," she began. "I've been looking into Eliza Langley's death, and I've found something remarkable. Sapphire brooch, hidden all these years. It's safe now, but it holds a secret, an inscription etched inside, naming the person responsible for her fall in 1895. The room tensed. Margaret's hand flew to her locket, her fingers tightening. Charles's smile vanished, his knuckles whitening on the armrest. Tom's eyes narrowed, fixed on Margaret. Evelyn, unaware of the inscription's fictional nature, gasped softly. Miss Marple watched them all, her knitting needles idle in her lap, her mind cataloguing their reactions. "An inscription," Charles said, his voice strained. "That's impossible. The brooch was stolen, melted down years ago." "Was it?" Miss Marple asked, her tone mild. "I found it buried under the oak tree where Eliza met her lover, Robert Vane. The inscription suggests she was pushed, not fallen, by someone close to her." Margaret stood, her face flushed. "This is absurd. You're inventing stories too. Tarnish our name. I won't stay for this." She moved toward the door, but Miss Marple's voice stopped her. "Please, Mrs. Langley, sit. The inscription mentions a family member, someone who stood to lose if Eliza took the brooch and eloped. James, perhaps." Tom leaned forward, his voice low. "It was James. I told you, Miss Marple, he argued with Eliza that night. I saw him near the balcony, and Clara saw it too." Margaret whirled on him. "Lies. You're a bitter old man. Tom Digby, clinging to a fantasy that Eliza was your sister. James was a gentleman, not a murderer." Charles rose, his charm replaced by agitation. "Enough, both of you. Miss Marple, you're stirring up trouble with no proof. Where's this brooch? Show us. Double quotes. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It's safe, Mr. Langley, but your interest is telling. Clara Weston told me you've been searching the garden, perhaps for the same brooch you claimed was melted down. Charles's face reddened, but before he could respond, Evelyn spoke, her voice trembling. Aunt Margaret, you burned papers in the garden. Were they about Eliza? Did you know what happened? Margaret's locket gleamed as she clutched it, her voice icy. I burned old letters, Evelyn, nothing more. You're too young to understand family loyalty. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the locket, its shape too familiar. That locket, Mrs. Langley, does it hold a photograph, perhaps of Eliza, or something else? Margaret's hand dropped, her composure cracking. It's a family keepsake, she snapped. You've no right to pry. The room fell silent, the fire's crackle amplifying the tension. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. The brooch's inscription is a fiction, I confess, but your reactions are not. Someone here knows the truth about Eliza's death, and the brooch's recovery threatens to expose it. Charles paced, his hands clenching. This is a farce. I'm leaving. He moved toward the door, but Tom stood, blocking his path. You're not going anywhere, Tom said. Not until you admit what your father did. Eliza was my sister, and James killed her to keep the brooch and the family fortune. Miss Marple watched closely, noting Charles's glance at Margaret, a silent plea for support. Margaret's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Evelyn, tears in her eyes, turned to Miss Marple. What do we do now? We wait, Miss Marple said softly. The truth has a way of rising, like cream in a churn. As the gathering dispersed, Charles and Margaret left separately, their faces masks of unease. Tom lingered, thanking Miss Marple quietly. I hope you're close, he said, for Eliza's sake. Miss Marple walked back to her cottage under a starlit sky, the brooch still hidden, her trap set. The chapter closed as she sat by her fire. Knitting resumed, her mind sifting through the evening's revelations. Charles's agitation and Margaret's clutch on the locket were cracks in their armor. The fictional inscription had done its work, stirring guilt and fear. Miss Marple knew the final confrontation was near, and she was ready to pull the last thread. Chapter 10. The legacy avenged. The fire in the Langley Hall drawing room cast flickering shadows across the oak-panelled walls, its warmth doing little to ease the chill of anticipation as Miss Jane Marple stood before a small, tense gathering. The sapphire brooch, recovered from beneath the oak tree in Chapter 8, remained hidden in her cottage, its glittering presence a silent catalyst for the trap she had set in Chapter 9. The fictional inscription she'd invented had stirred guilt and fear in Charles and Margaret Langley, and Tom Digby's accusation that James, Charles's father, had murdered Eliza, Tom's sister, had cracked the family's facade. Tonight, Miss Marple intended to unravel the final threads of the 1895 murder, bringing justice to Eliza and closure to St. Mary Mead. Evelyn Langley, pale but resolute, had arranged the gathering at Miss Marple's request, inviting Charles, Margaret and Tom under the pretense of resolving family matters. The room was smaller than before, the chairs arranged intimately around a mahogany table, a single lamp illuminating the faces of those present. Evelyn fidgeted with her bracelet, her green eyes darting to the door. Margaret sat rigid, her locket gleaming at her throat, her grey eyes cold. Charles, his usual charm replaced by a taut expression, tapped his fingers on the table. Tom stood by the window, his weathered face set in quiet determination. Miss Marple began, her voice calm but carrying the weight of truth. Thank you for coming. The sapphire brooch, lost since Eliza Langley's death, has been found, and with it, evidence of a crime long buried. Eliza did not fall by accident in 1895. She was pushed, and the brooch was hidden to conceal the motive. Margaret's hand tightened on her locket, her voice sharp. This is nonsense, Miss Marple. You've no proof, only village gossip and a mad gardener's tales. Tom's eyes flashed, but Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing him. Not gossip, Mrs. Langley, evidence. Letters from Eliza to Robert Vane, found in a safe deposit box, reveal she planned to elope with the brooch. James, your husband, opposed her, fearing the loss of the family fortune. Clara Weston, a maid at the time, saw him argue with Eliza on the balcony that night. Charles stood, his face flushed. Clara's a liar, and you're meddling where you're not wanted. The brooch is gone, and so is Eliza. Let it rest. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. But the brooch isn't gone, Mr. Langley. I found it under the oak tree where Eliza met Robert, and your reaction to my mention of an inscription, fictional, I admit, tells me you know more than you claim. Evelyn gasped, her hand covering her mouth. You lied about the inscription. A small deception, Miss Marple said gently, to stir the truth, and it has. Mrs. Langley, your locket. May I see it? Margaret's face paled, her fingers clutching the locket. It's a private keepsake. You've no right. But Miss Marple's voice was firm. It bears the Langley crest, doesn't it? And inside, a lock of Eliza's hair, perhaps. Or a fragment of the truth you've guarded for James. The room fell silent, the fire's crackle amplifying the tension. Margaret's hand trembled, and the locket slipped, falling to the floor with a soft clink. Tom stooped to retrieve it, but Miss Marple was quicker, her fingers deftly opening the clasp. Inside was a tiny sapphire chip, unmistakably from the brooch, and a folded note in faded ink. Forgive me, Eliza. J. Margaret's composure shattered, her voice a whisper. James, he didn't mean to. It was an accident. Miss Marple shook her head. Not an accident, Mrs. Langley. The coroner's note mentioned bruising, inconsistent with a fall. James argued with Eliza, pushed her in. Anger, and hid the brooch to cover his crime. You helped him, didn't you? Burning papers, keeping Clara silent, wearing this locket as a penance. Charles lunged forward, his voice desperate. You can't prove that. My father was no murderer. But Miss Marple turned to him, her gaze piercing. You knew, Mr. Langley. You found the safe deposit box, took the brooch's pouch, and searched the garden to ensure it stayed hidden. The threatening note in London, the stranger watching Evelyn's a statue doing to protect your father's secret. Charles's face crumpled, and he sank back into his chair. I was a boy when father told me, he admitted, his voice breaking. He said Eliza's death was a mistake, that she'd threatened the family's honor. I found the box years later, but the brooch was gone. I thought, if it stayed lost, no one would know. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. You let me live in this house, knowing it was built on a lie. Margaret spoke, her voice hollow. I loved James. He was desperate to keep the estate intact. Eliza's elopement would have ruined us. I helped hide the brooch, but I never meant for anyone to suffer. Miss Marple's expression softened, though her resolve was firm. The truth has a way of surfacing Mrs. Langley, Tom, Clara, and the evidence letters, the coroner's note, the brooch confirmed James's guilt. And you, Charles, perpetuated the cover-up. Tom stepped forward, his voice steady. Eliza was my sister. I want justice, but I want peace too. Miss Marple nodded. And you shall have it. She had already informed Inspector Craddock, a trusted contact from Scotland Yard, who arrived quietly at the hall's entrance. Charles, his head bowed, offered no resistance as the inspector led him away for questioning about his attempts to intimidate witnesses. Margaret, tears streaming, agreed to cooperate. Her confession a weight lifted after decades. Evelyn approached Miss Marple, the brooch now in her hands, its sapphires gleaming. What do I do with this? It's brought nothing but pain. Keep it, Miss Marple said gently. Not as a treasure, but as a reminder of Eliza's courage. Use it to honor her perhaps, a donation to the village in her name. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple walked back to her cottage under a starlit sky, the weight of the mystery lifted. The next morning, she sat in her garden, knitting resumed, the familiar click of needles a soothing rhythm. Evelyn visited, her face brighter. I'm selling the hall, she said. I'll start fresh, maybe fund a library for St. Mary Mead, for Eliza. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. A fitting legacy, my dear. The chapter and the story closed as Miss Marple sipped her tea, the village quiet around her. The brooch, the letters, and the locket had unveiled a truth buried for decades. James's crime, Margaret's complicity, and Charles's desperation were laid bare, and Eliza's memory was restored. As the church bells chimed, Miss Marple reflected on the predictability of human nature greed. Fear and love twisted into tragedy, but always, inevitably, unravelled by truth. Her work was done, and St. Mary Mead was at peace.